China. The prisoners at Wake Island were primarily the Marines and a few naval personnel, together with a whole bunch of civilians there who were with one of the Pacific Contracting Organization, which was a conglomerate of different construction companies that were building throughout the island bases in preparation for a possible war against Japan. And they were all doing this just prior to World War II. So they were on Palmyra Island, Guam, Wake Island, and a number of those islands out there, including the Philippines. And they had been out there prior to the war building, and these were construction companies. And these people who were out there doing construction were civilian contractors. As a result of their involvement out there, came Seabees. And as a result of the participation of civilians in the battles everywhere else, the Navy decided that they needed their own construction force and how this evolved the Seabees as we know them. But at any rate, what I'm going to be dealing with is the area of Wake Island and that area and this entire topic, which in a sense is a very tough one for a lot of people to accept.
Say, could they make an announcement out there in the lobby that there's a meeting?
I don't know. Maybe
I'll see if I can say something.
Yeah, okay. Because they had screwed up over there on the mailing. I don't know if you had heard that before I got
Yeah,
here.
I haven't heard any announcements, but I was thinking if they could make an announcement that there's a lot of people roaming around out there.
Yeah, okay. It'll take you from there. But basically, what it comes out to is this. In terms of seeing where we were at that particular point, we were in the Pacific at this particular location. And as you can see, we're dealing with Hawaii over here. That is Wake Island. It's in yellow. And then as you see this area up here in China, Shanghai, Korea, this entire area, these little areas that I'm talking about for the most part. And more specifically, we're going to be dealing with prison camps in order for you to get an idea as to what occurred. After the Japanese conquered the Marines on Wake Island, there were civilians over there, and the people who were on the Yangtze River, and also the Marines and naval personnel who were in Tencin, Shanghai, Peking, they gathered around 1,500 people and put them into a camp just outside of Shanghai, over here, called Busan Camp, and later on became Tianwan. But they came primarily from those areas together with Wake Island here, where 1,500 people, all military personnel, some British, and then the only civilians were some that they had racked up. The civilians who were put there from Wake Island were put there because they took part in the defense of Wake Island. So as far as the Japanese were concerned, they said, if you participated in the defense and fought against us, we are not going to regard you as civilian personnel. You were military. So they took all of these civilians and threw them right into a military camp. And as far as this is concerned, this may surprise some people, but take a look at the headline and see who did this. This is the English language edition of Japan Times for December the 8th, 1941. And this was published right through the entire war. And I went through every single edition of this paper, and this is where it is. When we attacked, this was the headline of it. The important thing is that if you take a look at the Imperial Newspaper, this says, and it's printed every day, it is the code that says the Emperor is behind the whole thing. In other words, anyone who says the Emperor was not knowledgeable about World War II or wasn't for it, whatever it might be, this Imperial Newspaper indicates his knowledge, concern, and approval at the very start. But over here, they're very honest at the beginning. As you go on and read this, as I have, as you go on and you start looking at the Japan Times later on through the war, they probably sank 30 times more American ships than ever existed in order to keep the morale up. But over here, in this particular case, it says that the U.S. Marines disarmed. This is the group of Marines who remained behind in China. There were 204 of them, of which my brother was one. And they had, this is the article that was listed, captured, and it's listed here. And this is the first day of the war. The second day of the war is where, as far as is concerned, this is the start of exaggeration. As I started reading this and reading every single issue, they indicated that they took Wake Island. This is true. They did take over Shanghai. And if you saw the emperor, there's a picture, I believe it, the title of it has the emperor in it. Just recently about Shanghai during World War II. The Japanese had taken it over. And as you can see, they write about the attack on Pearl Harbor and everything else. And this was taken, I was actually dealing with copies of the paper and with microfilms, and some of it is clear, some of it is not. With regard to this, some of these pictures are not clear, but I happened to come across this. I mentioned to you the Marines, and some of the Marines were stationed in the embassy. And this is what these fellows looked like. This is a formal picture. The picture isn't too good, but this is where they were, just around on the week before they're being captured. And you can see what they look like in terms of their uniforms and what their faces look like, because they will look nothing like that a month from now. And this is the embassy group. It was a crack group of guys, very bright. And after the war, among the survivors, 75% of them were commissioned. But these were the Marines.
Move back to the middle of the picture. These are the guys that say this.
Yeah.
Are they Japanese or are they American?
No, these are all Americans. They were the officers. Prior to the war, all of our commissioned officers had swords. And this is the way it was. This was just prior to it. This was in 1941. And this is the American embassy there. Wearing those uniforms are medical naval personnel. You know, the Marines don't have medical personnel. They're Navy hospital corpsmen. And the physicians are part of that same group. So they all wear and are part of the Marine Corps. But this is the group as they were, and you can visualize what they looked like then. This particular picture is of a significance because this was a picture that was taken there, and these were all medical corpsmen. This fellow over here is my brother. Over here. And you may not be able to tell it, but he was an athlete. He was a wrestler, a boxer, and he knew how to live on the outside. He weighed 162 pounds there. When the war was on and they were all captured, most of the guys were down to 96, 97 pounds. He never got lower than 138. Don't ask me how he did it. And as a result of his physical condition, he was able to survive. In fact, he was given a medal on a basis of keeping another camp alive, really, as a result of his ability to pick up food. This particular building here is the one in which he was captured, because he and 22 other fellows were down here getting ready to get aboard a ship that was going to take them to the Philippines because war was happening. Everyone knew that war was going to occur. Everyone in China knew it ahead of time. They knew it. They were counting on it occurring on a Sunday. Everyone knew it was happening, but they in turn were surprised because it didn't occur on a Sunday, and they realized because of the change in dates that when it did occur, there was a mix-up on it. But in this particular building, he was captured with 18 other fellows, and he and the others were prepared to die at that particular minute because of the treatment of prisoners of war. He had a machine gun there on top of a crate, which I'll tell you about, and then they were given the orders to surrender. He had a breakfast. Prior to it, he knew he was going to be tied up for who knows how long, and
but this is the building in which he was caught. And that building is significant, and I'll mention why later on. As far as these fellows on top are concerned, my brother is the only one that survived the war. The others were all killed or died of some problems through it. And he himself died around 4 years ago. As far as they're concerned, knowing what was taking place over there, the Marines and everyone else, when they got into fighting, when the war started, they realized that survival was not going to be something great, because they saw the treatment of the Chinese there, which they were being used for bayonet practice. And this was right there in the area in which they were. They saw the treatment of these people being used for all reasons, because they operated in a completely different way. The Japanese, in their fight with China, the rape of Nanking, in which there were 200,000 people slaughtered, operated in a manner completely different than any of the Western countries. As far as the Marines of Tenzin are concerned, these are actual photos taken out of a Japanese paper. This fellow here is Colonel Ashurst, and he was surrendering at that time. He was in charge of the 204 Marines there, who were being marched down here and who were getting aboard a train. And they were forced to march in between with the Chinese people who were Japanese sympathizers, who were throwing things at them. They were treated badly from the moment of capture. They were thrown into a base prior to going to that camp I told you about, but they spent around a month or so in Tenzin before they went down to this camp in just outside of Shanghai. Leaving that particular group, you've got another group, and this happens to be the group at Wake Island. And as far as this is concerned, Wake is 4 square miles, 21 feet above the water. It's composed of 3 islands of Wilkes, Peel, and Wake Island, and they were getting this place ready for war, and they had 1,500 civilians there who were working, and they were putting up these camps and getting reinforcements all over. Pan American had an airline there. There was a hotel there. The civilians had a camp there for contractors. The Marines, naval personnel were there. And just at the time they were doing this, 12 airplanes from a carrier came through. They didn't have a chance to build revetments. They didn't have a chance to get hangars. They didn't have a chance to get radar. They didn't have a chance to do anything. They were just landed, and at that particular point, the war started. Now we come to something else again, and I show you the picture of an individual. This is a civilian on Wake Island. His name is Joe Astorita. He lives in Florida right now, and this was taken by me when I met with him not long ago. I'm showing him because he's a key man in the material I'll be showing very shortly. In his left hand, over here, are 2 shaving cream tubes given to him by the Red Cross. He was an artist. He was originally from Brooklyn. And the Japanese had a little treatment of wounds or anything else. It was a little bag filled with charcoal that whenever you were sick on anything, you would eat it, you would put it on, whatever it might be, and it was like toilet paper, except it was very hard. And he was an artist, and he would, at night, draw pictures, and he rolled them into a ball and put them into these shaving tubes that you see. And he did this for almost 4 years, until for 4 straight years he'd get these. He carried them in a little bag. When the Japanese ran inspections, they would take them, they would look at them, it was still soft, they would throw them back at him, and they didn't discover this for over the period, because if they did, he would have been beheaded. After the war ended, he came out and he took these little things and he made them into pictures, which you will see, and he spent 1.5 years making those pictures because he couldn't do anything else. He had to get it out of his mind. But this is Joe over here. On the right-hand side, he was an artist, but he was also a thief. And what he had done was, one day the Japanese had him open up the storeroom for food, and they gave him a key. So on his way there, he dropped the key into the mud, stepped on it, picked it up, turned it in, came back later. The Americans went out and made a casting of that key. They made their own, and he was able to get in there to steal food. And here are some of the pictures. He has a unique style. I have all of the original pictures. There are 41 original pictures, which I'm turning over to the Marine Corps in September. And this just happens to be Wake Island, but he uses a very specific style in which he uses dots and dashes and everything else, and you can't really tell much from this picture, but you will in a second, because what he has done is record the only drawings of the chronological capture of Wake Island. There weren't any pictures taken, nothing was done, and in his case, what he did was to start at the very outset in drawing pictures of Wake from the very start. As soon as Pearl Harbor was attacked, they were attacked by these planes. These were Bettys coming in. As I told you, the 8 American planes, I should say the 12 American planes were, 4 of them were on duty. They came in, there was a rain squall, there was no radar, and they destroyed all of the planes on the ground except one. So on the very first day, all that were left on Wake Island were 5 planes without radar and without protection. And they came in out of the sky, gliding in. You couldn't even hear them because of the surf. And this is what occurred there. And you can see his style that he has here. He also was able to catch what was occurring. It may not be too clear, but over here is the Pan American base. The first thing the Japs had done was to destroy the oil, the fuel oil over there. They bombed and strafed everything, but they missed the Pan American plane. After they left, there was a little time left before the next attack, so they sent as many people out as they could on there. One of the fellows was supposed to go, and he had the wrong paper in his hand, and I said, "You can't go because it doesn't meet the qualifications." They sent him back, and he spent 44 months in prison camp. But this is where it is. You can see the style that he uses. I had this evaluated by professional artists, and his style is such that it's very primitive and very raw. He never had lessons, but they said he had true talent. And they got the fuel tanks on the very first day, and this is a drawing of the fuel tanks exploding. They got rid of these, as I said, during the first 24 hours. The contractor's camp, where he was just totally ruined. And you can see the style, very impressive. And with these shell holes, with all of these bomb holes, and what they had done all to everything they had over there, the stores and so on. And over the course of 16 days until the battle ended, they were in for a very rough time. This used to be the hospital. It was all collapsed. And this is a very dramatic picture. I mentioned the Grumman planes that were there, that were all hit. And this is where it is. The Grumman organization is using this drawing as part of their historic museum. But before they could get off the ground, they were hit by the Japanese. Now these are the things from his memory that he had put down on these little things, these little papers. The other aspect is right here. The Japanese, in order to land, they were going to be coming ashore, but it should be remembered, and I don't have the entire battle here, but it was really in 2 phases. as far as the Japanese are concerned, they came along and they tried to get ashore. They were murdered. We sank several, they waited until the ships came close. We sank a destroyer, we sank a submarine. We made direct hits on a number of vessels out there. As they came ashore, they were repulsed, and it was as a result of this that they thought they were going to take this within hours, that they asked for the fleet coming back from the bombing at Pearl Harbor to make a swing back and bombard this island so that they were hit by that big fleet so that they in turn would be able to send these men ashore. There were around 850 Japanese who were killed. What they did was to take these two old destroyers and they beached them and they let the fellows get ashore. Now, with regard to what occurred, as far as the Marines are concerned, they were very, very, very upset because I have the battle plans and I have everything else, but a whole bunch of the Marines were fighting in different formations, and these guys were well trained in terms of infantry tactics. And they actually were repulsing many, many groups of the Japanese. They were actually slaughtering them, and they were pushing them in one direction, pushing them in another. There were certain ones that were pushed in a corner where they couldn't do anything. There were two aviators who lost their planes, who served as infantry leaders. When you hear about Wake Island, believe me, whatever you've heard is true. Whatever you've heard is not part of the movies. Whatever those fellows did, their infantry tactics, whatever they established over there, they fought like beavers. As far as the civilians are concerned, the civilians, a lot of them were in the Civilian Conservation Corps before the war. A lot of them were Army, Navy, and Marine veterans. So they actually got involved over here, you know, with the servicemen, with the Marine Corps, and their job, including Joe Astorita's, was moving the guns from one place to another, so as the Japs came and attacked, they'd be coming to a bare area where previously there had been guns. So they were doing that. There were a number of them who were manning guns, so they actually participated. There were a number of them, by the same token, who ran off into the fields and got drunk. But the fact remains that they did participate. These guys, by the way, 3 years ago, were all declared to be naval veterans. Anyone who was on Wake Island as a civilian became a naval veteran of World War II. Joe Astorita he became a naval veteran eligible for help by the hospitals, by the Veterans Hospital, several Purple Hearts. He was wounded several times, getting a 50% disability. But these fellows were all veterans. I'm talking about the civilians. But here are these two destroyer transports that came in. When they were captured, they were trudged off along the water, and when Joe Astorita looked off into the side, this is what he saw. And if it appears to be black, it's for that reason. He looked at these vessels. They had been ordered to surrender. They were surrendering. They were all marching along the water, and as he looked out, he saw all of these Japanese vessels that were there. They were all taken from there to an airfield, and they were told to strip, and they spent 2.5 days in the sun without water. The Marines, everyone else, were right there. It should be pointed out that you've heard of Devereaux. Devereaux was Major Devereaux was the head of the island for a while, and then you had the head of the Air Force. They were both equal, and then a fellow named Cunningham, Commander Cunningham, came in, and he was in charge of both. So it's a naval island under naval command, Marine Air Force, Marine Naval Air Force, with Devereaux as the Marine infantry person responsible to Cunningham. But Cunningham got there 9 days before the battle, and no one even knew that he had been there. And as a result of it, you never heard of him, and especially with the Marine Corps Public Relations Department, you always only have heard of Devereaux. But if you look at the command structure, he was not in command at Wake Island. And as a result of that, it's a controversy. Cunningham was not invited to Washington. Devereaux was. this fellow Putnam from the Air Force was, and it's never been straightened out. His widow has been trying to get this thing straightened out for her whole life. As far as the capture is concerned, I mentioned the civilians because this is from a book that was put out by the organization Pacific Bases, and these are all of the people. There were, I believe that there were 1,100. I thought it was 1,500, but around 1,100. This fellow that you see here is 21 years old. Where my yellow mark is, that's Joe Astorita. And this picture was taken of them on their way. They were given their clothing again, and they were permitted to walk along the water. So that scene you had just seen before was when they were walking this way over to landing craft. On the landing craft, they got aboard, and they were put on this landing craft, and they were heading out to a ship called the Nida Maru. And this was a prison transport ship that was going to take them to Japan and China. And as Joe looked off into the distance, he saw the Nida Maru, and they were all wondering what life was going to be like when they got there. And as they got there, they soon discovered the Japanese sailors and Marines beat the hell out of them through a gauntlet as they were running there. They were hit with bats, and anyone who had glasses had them taken off and thrown and broken. And they stole watches and they stole everything else, and they were thrown into the hold. And as far as the hold is concerned, on the Nida Maru, this was life for 16 days. If you said anything, or if you asked for an additional blanket, or you did anything whatsoever, you would get the hell beat out of you. You would be tied up by your thumbs. And they beat the hell out of these guys down there. And this is the way they were. And they were fed by buckets coming down with food. And as far as their waist was concerned, it went up the same way. And for 16 days they were there. And then all of a sudden, they separated the officers from these fellows, and all of a sudden, 5 guys were called. After they made a stop in Japan, 5 guys were called on the way to China, and they were called out because apparently they were radio men who didn't say they were radio men. And as they got up on deck, there was a fellow named Captain Saito, who was a Marine officer in the Japanese Marine Corps, and said, "We are at war, and in order to show where you are," he got the entire crew out there, and it's not said, but the 5 Americans whose names are known were beheaded. They published a newspaper after they landed over in Wusong. And this was from a paper called Freedom. And as you can see you've got Devereux. This was published in Life magazine. You've got Devereux. You've got some of the British officers who operated in their own way, where their discipline was a heck of a lot different than ours. This picture down here, the fellow in the Navy officer is the one I mentioned before. That's Commander Cunningham, who was unfortunate because not only did no one know he was there, but he was in camp only 2 weeks, and he escaped, or tried to escape, and he was caught and he was put in a special prison for the rest of the war. So no one even knew where he was. So no one ever knew where he was on the island, and no one knew where he was during the war. But as far as these people are concerned, this is the Nida Maru that they're aboard on their way there to China. And as far as propaganda is concerned, when they landed over there in China, and again, this is part of this same magazine, it indicated to them, indications were that these fellows were given radios and communication, were being treated very nicely. And as far as these people are concerned, they're people I know of that I have met. There is a Dr. Khan, who is a hero at Wake Island. and a number of these other people I had met before they died. This Lieutenant Poindexter is one of the heroes of Wake Island. He led one of these infantry battalions, and he is still active in the Wake Island Marines. And those fellows are meeting they're meeting in September in Arlington. As far as these guys are concerned, once they got into prison camp, here is a picture. And you'll notice something there. Everyone kept their food in those bags that you see. But in addition to that, you can see rats up here. And these rats would travel in herds. You could hear them like horses. And they would travel all over the place. And the fellows lived like this, and you can see what they looked like as compared to what they were before. Remember now, you've got the Wake Island Marines that came in there with summer clothing, and this was really cold there. And you had the others that came in from Tenson and Peking. They were all together with the civilians that were captured. And as far as these rats were concerned, there's a story about them from one of the fellows. I was at a convention and with these Marines, and one of them had the bright idea. He said, you know, we're starving. Because the Japanese purposely fed them a certain number of calories to keep them weak and to get their weight down, so that their own men would be much bigger and stronger and tougher than any prisoner. But one of them said, you know, I have an uncle who was in World War I. And what they did, since they were out of food, they were hungry, and they ate rats. And someone said, well, if they ate rats, we'll eat rats. Which they did. So after the war, he went back to see his uncle, and he said, you know, I want you to know that story you told me about eating rats. He said, how you did this in France, it really saved our lives. I mean, we really followed through, and we ate rats there, and it was all because you said so. He said, said so? I said, rats? He said, I didn't tell you we ate rats. He said, we were so hungry that we could have eaten rats, you know. But at any rate, here's where they are. In order to keep warm, this is what they had to do. For hours after hours after hours in North China, they would walk through the middle of the night, and this is what they had done just to keep warm. I use this picture as a cover for a book on this that I've done. And again, in trying to keep warm, what kept them warm was drinking tea. That's all. They loved tea because it warmed them out, warmed them entirely. But this is what they lived like in this camp that had around 6 buildings like this. And this was the area that they cooked in. Now it should be remembered why they were treated the way they were. The reason that they were treated the way they were is that as far as the Japanese were concerned, anyone who surrendered was dead. And they would not acknowledge any of their own men who surrendered. If you surrendered, you were dead. Anyone who surrendered from the enemy was a coward. And therefore, although they agreed to the treatment of prisoners of war, they signed this thing, it meant nothing to them. It was unilateral, because they had no prisoners that they were concerned about, and they regarded everyone else as a coward. So therefore, they had these Koreans, and they had other low-level people under the command of an officer with these prisoners, and these guys were horrible. And they operated as they did in the Chinese, in the Japanese army, with everyone gets beaten, not only prisoners, but the officers in their own army beat the enlisted men. It's the way that they operated. And here is a matter of rice, distribution of rice by the ounce, whereby they would have everything where they would work together on this. My brother, by the way, was a medical corpsman taking care of these guys. He was with a physician named Dr. Foley, who's still alive. And his job was taking care of all of these fellows, at which time they were involved in everything, all sorts of diseases coming from lack of vitamins, beriberi. And that's one of the problems with these survivors of this war, that They go back and are treated at the VA or other places, and the fellows who were treating them, the physicians, were not even born when any of these things turned up. And they have problems with their joints. Joe Astorita, as a result, had frozen feet, has tingling in his feet. They don't believe it. And you're dealing with a completely different world now than we had then. And this is just a picture of the watchtower during the water tower, I should say, during the summer. And the same scene during the winter. It was cold as hell over there. The Red Cross packages would come and they would be stolen by the guards. They wouldn't even get through. They were given jobs without equipment. Here, by manual labor, they were given a job of digging a canal. All they were given was a pick and a shovel, and they had to dig this canal that you see here. And of course, civilians were there. The civilians kept on living. They lived out the camp, and many of them were involved in the black market. Dr. Foley, that I mentioned before, he spoke Chinese, and he was involved in the black market. And he apparently was accused of trading with the Chinese, and he was taken by a fellow that I'll show you in a minute. He was taken aside, and they had a way of working with him. They would lie you down, and the first thing they would do would be to break your nose. And when they broke your nose, the blood would come there so you couldn't breathe through it. And then they would give you water torture. And he had his arms twisted and his fingers broken and everything else. And they threw him into a location where he was to be for a period of 3 weeks. He was in a coma. My brother won the Silver Star by getting into the latrine and operating through the latrine system day in and night, climbing through the latrines, and bringing food to him and keeping him alive so that when he actually got out, he weighed as much as he did when he went in. But when you were dealing with them, it was something else again. And this happened to be a picture that Joe had seen where they got this coolie and they tied glass around his neck. And in freezing weather, they took off his clothing, threw this ice water at him, and he froze to death. As far as the Japanese were concerned, they did crazy things. If they said, and the fellows really didn't know what they were doing until the war, until later on, they would go like this, and it means come here. And this fellow didn't come here, and they shot him. And they would do dumb things like barracks. They would go through looking for hidden food. So they'd go through, and if they were looking for food, they wouldn't find that you were okay. But you could have a knife there, and they wouldn't say anything. In other words, their job was to look for food, and they wouldn't think of anything else. Certain officers were there. This happened to be the commandant, who died later on. His name was Otera. And they gave names to all of these people. And this is a fellow who was known as Handlebar Hank. And when they, in the matter of war crimes trials, because no one ever really knew the names of these individuals, whatever nicknames they had, that's the way they were cross-indexed. And he was something else again. This is a job that they had to do. Joe Astorita had to clear this field with some other men, and he refused to do it, and he was beaten. Eventually the field looked like this. And here, if you're looking for a villain, is the biggest of them all. This is a fellow known as the Beast of the East. And he was supposed to have been born in Hawaii, or worked in Hawaii, but he was absolutely the sadist. He is the one that broke the nose of Dr. Foley. And he developed that little mountain that you see called Mount Fuji. And all of the fellows had to work on that for 18 months, and they didn't know why. And the purpose of it was really to build a rifle range for the Japanese. And he was completely horrible when he said he was always involved breaking bones, hitting people. He was mentioned in every single case of cruelty that came out of that camp. And here is how the fellows worked. They had to push by hand these carts up to the top of this mountain that really resulted in nothing. It was a range. And here is another picture. Whenever you meet any of the people, they always talk about him. So since they were always talking about him, when I was in Washington, I decided I would do something. And when he was alive, he said, while the war was on, Ishihara, that if we lose, if the Japanese lose, I'm going to cut my head off. That's what he said. I'm going to cut my head off. The war ended. And it turned out that he stayed in Shanghai. He didn't go to Japan, but he stayed in Shanghai. And as a result of what he did, he really didn't cut his head off. Instead, he cut off his finger. I happened to get down there to the archives, and I found that here he was. And here he was arrested, and as far as he was concerned, he had been trying to turn himself in to help in the war crimes trial, except he didn't figure on certain things. That when he was trying to turn himself in, the war had ended, and when the war ended, they released the prisoners of war, and I personally was in Tulagi, and I tried to get off my ship in order to get to my brother in Japan. And here he was at trial. But what had happened was while they were at trial, or I should say while he was asking these questions, I was in touch through our executive officer with the Americans trying to locate my brother. And they said, he was here, he was at Sendai 11, which was in Japan. And everyone is taken care of at Sendai 11 but your brother. We don't know where he is. He had traveled on his own to Shanghai after this guy. And he got there, and I told you how well he was built after the war. And when he got there, charges had not been filed against him yet. And he asked for 2 minutes with them, and they gave him 5. I think he broke around 8 ribs. This fellow here is a guard, and he was known as Mortimer Snerd. And he was not too bright, and everyone said, who is Mortimer? He would keep on asking, who is Mortimer Snerd? And they would say, oh, he's a famous American movie star, and he's very happy. Until someone finally told him he was like a cartoon character, at which time he got very, very upset. But this was one of the guards too. With regard to other scenes in prison camp, this again is the barber shop. There are 40 pictures that Joe had done, and the sort of clothing that they wore. They were given Japanese boots, but of course the shoes were too small, so they used to cut holes in them. And they would wear rags, be bare feet, or make their own type of clothing. But this is what they wore. And as far as the prison camp is concerned, it looked like this. And this is an actual plan of the structure that these fellows were in. And they were not supposed to be able to do things that would help the enemy, but here they were polishing shells. I mean, artillery shells and small caliber. And then later on, they were all sent over to Japan to work in coal mines and on the docks. And that's where things really got tough. But here are additional Japanese officers, and they operated in a very crazy, crazy manner. And you could tell from this what his feelings were. There are enemies, but they're Well, this happens to be another fellow there who always wore oversized shoes and loved his horse. And there are heroes. And this man is a hero who is still alive. He was a Japanese physician. And he's still alive, and he still is in touch with all of the prisoners of war. This man saved many, many, many lives. And because of his helping the Americans, he was given a very, very hard time by the Japanese. And this is another commandant who just loved to take pictures of the Americans as if they were animals. They were all transported to camps because the Japanese later in the war, the Americans were coming, they didn't want these fellows to be recaptured, and they wanted to put them to work as slaves in working off ships, working in mines, working in plants, and all of those dots that you see represent prison camps that all of the prisoners were sent to. Over here is Sendai 11, which is where my brother went, which was one of the two worst prison camps in Japan. The fellows were losing an average of 3 pounds per week. And in order to live, they all had to go down a mountain, go up a mountain, do a whole day's work. And at night, my brother used to put a pack on his back and go out and pick up weeds and snakes and whatever he could in order to throw it back into a stew. They were there, and a number of the guards, as the war ended, committed suicide. Others were executed. And this is part of the work of Joe Astorita. In fact, that's a self-portrait of Joe working as a stevedore. Joe is an artist, ended up in a special camp later on in the war where there were people there for purposes of propaganda. And that's where he came in contact with Tokyo Rose. And the Tokyo Rose that we all know is not the Tokyo Rose that everyone thinks she is. If you remember seeing pictures of Tokyo Rose, who lives in Chicago, there were 8 women. And when they came to the radio station after the war, they said, "Are you Tokyo Rose?" to her. And she says, "Yeah, sure." And they said, "Would you like money?" "Yes." "Well, would you give us a story?" "Sure." And she was put on this program because she had a very squeaky voice. But it really wasn't her. It could have been any of these women over there. And as a result, she went through trials. She was freed. Walter Winchell got on her case. She put in many years in prison. Now she's working and living in Chicago. But over here is something else again. This again is another study of mine that I've done. And I think you've seen this, have you? This particular one affects us because on November the 15th, 1945, we were going to invade over here. We were going to invade Kyushu. And then on March 15th, we were going to hit this. I have the total battle plans over here, and I also have where every single DE was to have been, and every APD was to have been in this invasion. The Japanese said, had the war, if we were invaded, every American and other prisoner would have been executed because they did not want to spare the manpower watching them. So therefore, when the bomb was dropped and they gave up, these people, these prisoners of war, survived. That's a part of the story about the dropping of the bomb that not too many people understand, that many lives were saved, Japanese and American, by the dropping of it. As far as these pictures are concerned, during the war, when the war ended, we knew the location of every single PW camp. And our flyers would come over and do belly rolls, and they'd throw stuff over and so on. The tragedy of all of this is that sometimes things would happen. And the camp that my brother was in, they were dropping supplies. Some of these little kids started running out for it. 2 of our Marines from Wake Island ran out to protect the kids. And as these things came down, these buckets, they were killed by them in prison camp after the war ended. And as far as the camps were concerned, they were identified like this, the great big PWs. This is from a Japanese magazine, as you can see. And as the war ended again, here they are. This happens to be a group here, British and American. And this is the same picture in Japanese. And as far as the surrender is concerned, this happens to be the Japanese surrendering to the British. And here are some more of these guys, because the prisoners of war were not only in Japan, they were also out on a bridge on the River Kwai. They were captured by off the USS Houston and all of those ships back in 1942. And you know, these poor guys lived in all sorts of ways, and these happen to be Americans and British, and the way they were living. Again, this is in Japanese, but this is how they lived at that particular point. And these are pictures again from the magazine, and this happens to be one of the fellows who was released, giving one of these fellows a kick, and here they are. Going through all the equipment before their dispersal, at which time they were picked up, brought out to aircraft carriers, and then brought to Guam, and then Hawaii, and then the United States. One of the things that I wanted to mention, though, is this, that in Wake Island, there were 98 American contractors who were kept behind. 2 of them were executed. The other 98 were working as slaves on Wake Island. Everyone else had been brought away several years ago. In October of 1943, the Americans bombarded the island day and night. The Japanese were very, very, very angry. The commander of the camp took the remaining 98 Americans out in groups and had them shot, machine gunned, and then they finished them off with a pistol. Joe Astorita did this picture for me. I have a picture this high, and I asked him why the Japanese is so big, and he said, that's the way we looked upon it. It has almost a holy look to it. I have a picture at home that is so, I happen to be getting a picture here. This is the first time I've ever shown this to any audience. At which time they were hit by machine gun bullets and then finished off. These are the 98 American contractors who were not, just anonymous. Here are their names. The other thing is that the fellow who did it, they caught. Now, this is one of the important things. Remember, destroyer escorts were used at these surrenders. The USS Levy, the DE Levy, came in with 2 other DEs and handled the surrender at Wake Island. This guy, Admiral Sakibara, is the fellow who put that order through. We learned of it because we broke the code, and the fellows from the Levy came there and said, what's going on here? And he had a whole story made up that it wasn't anything at all, and what he had done was to rebury the bodies. So they finally dug them up. People started telling what went on, and he and his men, 16 men, officers, were taken before the courts on a court-martial, sentenced in Okinawa, no, I'm sorry, in Kwajalein, and executed at Guam. But here he is. And let me just mention a few other things. That is the story there in terms of them. But remember I showed you that little building where my brother was. When I was in college, I had remembered a story that my brother had told me about when he was in prison camp. And I read the New York Times saying that Peking Man, which are the bones of the Japanese or the Chinese archaeological, these are the bones of an ancient man of China, regarded as the cradle of civilization of their people. The bones were missing from Peking Medical College, and no one knew where they were. My brother had told me about this So I saw an article in the newspaper, in the New York Times, and it said, well, these bones were lost during the war. I called the science editor and said, I have an idea where they were. These were aboard a train, and my brother was involved with them at Qinhuangdao. All of a sudden, I heard nothing but silence at the other end of the phone. He said, where are you now? I told him where I was. He said, stay where you are. And all of a sudden, I had a delegation of 3 or 4 people coming down who asked me what I knew about it. And then I sent them back to my brother and to Dr. Foley, because it turns out that here are the bones, and here's the article involving a lot of people that at this particular time they had no idea what happened to the bones. And what had occurred was at Peking Medical College, with the Japanese coming in, they wanted to protect the bones and get them here to Cornell in New York. Dr. Foley was on his way to the United States. My brother was going to go aboard the same ship to the Philippines with the 4th Regiment. As they were to come down to Qinhuangdao to get aboard this ship, a train came down from where they were, and it had these boxes of bones on them. And they were entrusted to Dr. Foley, and that's the crate that my brother had there with the machine gun when he was captured. As the Japanese came in, they were all captured. They took the boxes out, and that's when no one knew anything. Dr. Foley operated in a very strange way, and since he knew the Japanese commandant that captured him, he was given 2 weeks to clean up his affairs. And he was told that he could have 2 weeks off before he went to prison. He claims that he took the boxes that were sent back to him because he was an officer and gave them to friends in China. Out of this whole thing that opened up, there were 3 documentaries, 7 books about this whole article, and the bones are still lost, and the only secret to where they are is with Dr. Foley, who is still alive and who wants to get back to China because he thinks he might be able to locate them, and he's waiting for things to clear, and I'm supposed to go with him. But this is the Peking man story that I think is interesting. The other thing that you might be interested in, you go ahead. I'll see you later. The other thing is this. I went with the Marines, of the North China Marines. I went there. And this was a picture taken of them a year ago. And this is what they are. We were all in Ohio. And these are all of the fellows who had been North China Marines. And the fellow in the center of the wheelchair, he's that way because of a torture by the Japanese. And the little guy that you see in the center here, right here, is the hero because he was a character who owned a bar in Shanghai. And he had heard of the Marines starving in there. So he arranged with a whole bunch of nuns to get a Christmas dinner, and he fooled the Japanese and said he wanted to bring something into them. And he himself arranged 1,500 turkey dinners in 1942 while these guys were starving. And he got them in there, and the Japanese gave him the permission. He did it. The fellows survived. They never ever forgot about it. And as a result, they were very angry with him for fooling them. They threw him into prison. And then, around 9 years ago, he turned up in Texas because he owned his own restaurant there, Jimmy's Chili's, as they found it. And these fellows found him and made an honorary member of him, and he's been going with them each year. And every one of these has a story to it. But this is where they are. These are the fellows that survive from the North China group. As far as the Wake Island Marines are concerned, they're meeting down in in Arlington in another 2 months, and I'll be putting this into shape and showing them these pictures. They've never seen these before. But as far as that's concerned, it's different. It's not the story of DEs, except where the Levy's involved, but I thought you might be interested in something like this. Because it has implications on the bomb, it has implications all the way around, and it's a hell of a lot different than anything that we've seen. Are there any comments about any of this at all that anyone has? Because if not, I'd like to show you just a few more pictures that you might be interested in. These are pictures that relate to destroyer escorts. No one has ever seen these pictures either. How many of you were ever in the Marshall Islands, the Gilberts, or any of those areas? Okay, so if you're out there, you'll notice something, that the islands that we were all traveling in are now countries. The Republic of the Marshall Islands is alone. Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas is with us. The Republic of Kiribati, the Republic of Palau. These are independent nations except for the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, which is affiliated with the United States. But as you deal with this particular one, many of us had served in different parts there, and Majuro and Owetok in the Marshalls and so on was all over here, Truk, etc. And as you deal with those islands, as you take the Marshall Islands alone, many of us had been involved over there. For instance, while we were there in Majuro, there were a number of islands that were still occupied by the Japanese in Jaluit, Wochi, Mulgrava, Mili, all over. We had bypassed all of those islands. And as you take these islands, as you take Wake Island, as you take a whole bunch of them, they found that the most effective ship for surrenders was going to be the destroyer escort. And they used many, many, many DEs for that particular purpose. In Palau, we ended up with, you've heard of naturally Peleliu, where a great battle took place, but the islands of Palau are here. It's also the site of a place whereby the Japanese had killed around 125 American prisoners. But then, these are pictures that have never really been seen by anyone. This is the USS Carroll that was brought into this for the purpose of getting the surrender of those islands. And as they were there, the Japanese started coming out to them. And coming aboard. And I think that one of the things that happens is that having been on a DE, as we all have, whether you're in battle or not, whenever you see any of these pictures, you always can imagine, because we were all on the same type of a ship, you could just imagine ourselves having been right there at this point. But here, they're taking these people aboard, medical treatment and part of the surrender. This happens to be very early September 1945. Because a lot of these islands were still left for a period of time. For instance, in the Solomon Islands area around Bougainville and all of that, tremendous numbers of Japanese prisoners were there, but we arranged for Japanese warships, the ones that were left, to go in there and pick them up. In fact, what had happened over here is that we arranged for a Japanese cruiser to come here. Pardon?
How long were these, they were bypassed? Did they have any access to food?
No. The only access to food they had was